All right, our guest that's on with us right now, we are so honored to have, is Stan Gordon. StanGordon.info is his website. Stan is he just tells it the way it is. Stan, I followed your work for many, many years, and I just like everything you do and all the time and the dedication that you put into all your work. It's amazing, and my hat's off to you for everything that you do.
Well, I appreciate it. And what might be a surprise to your listeners is that in all the years I've been doing this now, I have never personally seen a UFO or Bigfoot myself.
I was going to ask you that. That was my first question I was going to ask you. Have you seen something yourself?
I have not. I have seen a lot of evidence. I've gathered a lot of evidence. I've interviewed thousands of people, but I've never personally seen anything. And by the way, you might find it interesting that as we've been on the air, I am receiving emails from your listeners, and I want to make them aware. I will respond to all of them. But give me a little time because every day I get multiple emails in, so I will get back to them. Okay,
no problem, and that's good. That's good. Well, like I said, Stan, and I want you to take this as a compliment. You're a stand-up guy in the UFO community. I have had the honor to research a lot of to interview a lot of researchers. I'm not a ufologist by any way. I consider myself a researcher's researcher. I enjoy going through and interviewing people and letting them come on the show and talk about different things. And I kind of draw my own conclusions, but you're just kind of one of those boots to the ground, no BS kind of guys, and that's what I really like about everything that you do, and I just want you to know that.
And I appreciate that very much because a lot of what I've dealt with over the years has been very controversial, and my position is I don't have the evidence, I don't have the answers, but something is going on out there, and because we don't understand it and it's so strange, we shouldn't dismiss it, as many researchers and groups do out there, but we should be studying all aspects of any phenomena we deal with.
Right, right. And that was a question that somebody sent in here, said, Stan, other than reports, do you have any physical evidence coming from UFO sightings? Obviously, you just answered that you don't. It's more just reports and pictures.
Yeah, we do have some interesting, other than photographs. I mean, with Bigfoot, yeah, we have a lot of casts. We had some possible good hair samples back in the 70s, but back in those days, we had no DNA testing, and what analysis we were able to get done was destructive testing, which means when they used the sample, it was destroyed. So we don't have any of those remaining samples today, which is unfortunate. But in regard to UFO cases, yeah, we've had physical evidence cases. We've had landing cases where we had burnt areas, and we did analytical investigations of those areas. We've had other type of artifacts, interesting things that we've recovered over the years that they all have been explained as to what the material is, but many of them are very strange in what they are and why anybody would manufacture them and where they were found, which were isolated areas. And these are going back in the 60s and 70s, so there's some very interesting artifacts we have come up with. But, again, nothing that would say it's from another realm or from another dimension or from another world, but very interesting and very strange.
Very, very, very interesting. John Venturi was the researcher that did
John Ventry.
John Ventry, rather. He was the one that did the research. I was going through my notes. I was going through my notes, and he was on one of the programs where there was a craft that went over someone's house, and it was in Pennsylvania.
Yeah, that was down around the Harrisburg area.
Right.
Philadelphia area.
Gotcha. And it was dropping the stuff, and they actually took the leaves and had it looked like the leaves had been waved or something. I mean, it was something unique.
Yeah, every once in a while you get those kind of cases. And again, back in the 70s and 80s, we had a number of incidents like that, and you had something you could work with. And some of them were quite fascinating reports.
Exactly, exactly. Let's talk about when you look up UFO and Stan Gordon, Kecksburg comes up all the time. You are the Kecksburg guy. For our listeners that don't know what Kecksburg is about, could you kind of set the storyline a little bit for us?
Yeah, well, we could spend days talking about Kecksburg. And I remember the day it happened very well was a Thursday night back December 9th, 1965. I was 16 years old. And how it all unfolded, I was actually listening to an AM radio station, the Big K, the KDK in Pittsburgh that night, and there was a talk show. It's called Contact. And the host of that show had a guest on whose name you'll probably recognize was Frank Edwards.
Yes.
Who is a reporter who had written some books on flying saucers and strange happenings. So I'm already interested in these things at 16 years old, and I was tuned in to listen to Frank Edwards, see what he had to say. Well, within minutes of the show starting, the whole focus of the program was on this news story that was just breaking of this brilliant fiery object that was seen a short time before, late that afternoon, from Ontario, Canada, over Michigan, Ohio, and Pennsylvania. People reporting seeing this brilliant fireball, this fiery object moving across the sky, and it was about 4:47 p.m. when that object came in over the greater Pittsburgh area. Well, as it did, multitudes of people were jamming the phone lines at the radio and TV and newspapers reporting, and the police departments reporting seeing this fiery object. Some people thought it was an airplane on fire, and as the evening went on, they were beginning to read the newswire stories, which is breaking from AP and UPI, and they were interviewing eyewitnesses and other newsmen. And I wasn't even driving yet. I had no way to get out to where this thing reportedly fell, because as the evening continued on, the reports were whatever the object was, it apparently fell into a wooded area near the small farming community of Kecksburg in Westmoreland County, about 40 miles southeast of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and about 12 miles from where I lived. And it was an amazing evening. I remember I'm running back and forth. We had an old black and white console TV at the time, and I'm running back and forth between the TV and the radio trying to get the latest information. And I'm amazed because here's the late Bill Burns, who was a well-known reporter in Pittsburgh on KDK TV, breaking in with live reports that the military was now arriving in the Kecksburg area to search for an unidentified flying object.
Wow.
It was an amazing night, and I had no way to get out to the scene, and I couldn't wait to see if it was going to be the news in the paper the next day, and lo and behold, it's the front page headlines in all the local papers, and it was making national news. And our local paper was the Greensburg Tribune Review, which had two editions. In the early morning edition, the headline was, Army Ropes Off Area, Unidentified Flying Object Falls near Kecksburg. And, it was a pretty good-sized article and talked about this thing was seen over quite a distance, that apparently something did fall, that nobody was going to be allowed anywhere near whatever this thing was, and there was some talk that whatever it was, it may have been radioactive. They were talking about the fact that they were waiting on Army engineers and civilian scientists to arrive at the scene to examine it. And then the later edition had a number of different stories, including one that was the big feature story that searchers failed to find object. And it went on to say that, yeah, there was a search to early morning hours, but nothing was found. And officially, people had been mistaken. They had just seen a bright meteor in the sky, but nothing had fallen. And over the next couple of days, that was pretty much the end of the story. Officially, it was a meteor in the sky. Nothing had fallen to the ground. Everybody had been mistaken. And I remember really well that within days there was a lot of people around that area talking, people who claimed they had seen a large military flatbed tractor trailer truck carrying a large object out of the area late that night at a high rate of speed. And so anyhow, I began to follow up on it as soon as I could. Now, there was not a lot of information out there. There were very few names out there in the papers. And I'm in the city, and this is, in farm country out there, and I really didn't know hardly anybody. But I began to make a couple calls and found out a little bits and pieces of information. It wasn't much. And there just wasn't much to go on at the time. However, over a period of weeks and months and years, I began to get a lot of information coming in. I began to run into people, or people would contact me who were involved that night, who were out at the scene that night. I began to get leads from neighbors and friends and relatives of people who were involved. I would get anonymous tips from people to follow up on. And since that time, I've interviewed hundreds of people who were involved in the case. And there was so much that we have now been able to put together. And yes, there are many unanswered questions, but we've learned a lot. And there was so much happened at the time that we didn't know about at the time. One thing that was pretty apparent was that night, as this story is being broadcast on Pittsburgh area radio and TV, hundreds of people descended on that small farming community to try to get a look at the object that had fallen down into the wooded ravine, but they couldn't get anywhere near it. And it's hard to visualize this area, but here's a large wooded area, and there's a narrow farming road that parallels along that woods. And there were hundreds of people who were jamming that little country road that night. What they didn't know was the thing actually fell way down on the opposite side of the woods, down to the bottom of the ravine. And you could not possibly see where this thing came down unless you were standing there.
Right, right.
So anybody riding around that area could run around there day and night forever and not be able to see where it came down. What's also intriguing was the fact that not only did hundreds of people come out that night, but all the major news people were there. So you had reporters from all the major radio and TV and newspapers on the scene. And they became witnesses themselves because they interacted in some cases or saw the authorities who were there, the state police, the fire department, and the military. Some of them interacted with the military people on the scene. And, of course, they couldn't go down. Bob Gaddy was the local reporter for the Tribune Review. He was convinced there was something down there. He wanted to go down, and they prevented him, and he said, what if I go? And they said, you'll be arrested. So he couldn't go down. Another fellow, Bill Weaver, was riding his dad's car out there. He was on the opposite side of the woods. There was a little farm lane that became very important because it was on that farm lane closest to the impact site where a lot of the military activity was taking place. And various people found their way onto that small farming lane. And that's where a lot of things were going on. It was very, very interesting. And there are many, many stories from different people who saw that. But I started to mention Bill Weaver was over on the farm lane, and as activity was going on that night, he was told to leave the area, and he said, no, I'm going to stick around and watch. They said, if you don't leave, we're going to confiscate your car. So, again, that's his dad's car, so he didn't want to lose his dad's car. So something was going on there. And what makes things even more intriguing is that a number of people who have gone on public record now, and others who I've talked to privately, went on record and said that armed soldiers aimed their weapons at them to prevent them from going down to see what was down in the wooded ravine. So I've asked for years and years, where did that jurisdiction come from for armed soldiers to come out on other people's private property to prevent other civilians from going down on other people's property? What was so important down there they were trying to hide? So what we now know is this. This object, whatever it was, it came in from the greater Pittsburgh area and moved over the city of Greensburg where I live. It moved out roughly towards Route 30 East, but it made a turn to the south. And it's seen by people in all these little farming communities going out towards the mountain of Laurelville. And out in that mountain area, apparently it kind of hesitated, made a turn, began to track towards Kecksburg, made another turn, and dropped down into the wooded ravine. Now, this thing was moving relatively slowly. It was making change of directions along its path, along its trajectory, and it made a slow descent. It didn't come down, as you would expect something falling from the sky, like a meteor or reentry of space debris, something come out at a high rate of speed. It didn't do that. People said it looked like a small aircraft on approach to an airport. It came down relatively slowly. There were no parachutes seen, and moments after it fell, people saw like a column of like a bluish-gray smoke coming up over the trees, and then it vanished very quickly. No reports we could ever confirm of actually like a fire. Right. So what we now know is this. After it fell, a number of independent local people ran down in the woods to see what had fallen. They came across this large, metallic acorn-shaped object, kind of an off-gold bronze color, big enough for a man to stand inside of. It's semi-buried in the ground. Some people were only a few feet away from it, looking at this thing.
Right.
And there's no weld marks, no rivet marks, no seams, no fuselage, no windows. They didn't see any way to get in or out of this thing. And it's one solid piece of metal. And at the raised up back, like you'd have on an acorn, some people call it the ring area, another witness calls it the bumper area, raised up off of that surface were these unusual markings that look more like symbols than writing. And the one witness who spent years in the library looking over different ancient languages to try to figure out what he saw said the closest thing he could recall would be ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics. And so anyhow, that's just the basic, and there's a lot more I can tell you about the story.
Couple questions on Kecksburg. First of all, something that comes up. I'm going to combine these questions together. It was a lot of people have kind of suggested that this could have been some sort of Nazi technology, like the German bell.
Yeah, and I expect you to do that right away because that keeps coming up more and more.
What do you think of that?
It's one of numerous possible origins for the object that people have come to me. And it's interesting because in all the years I've been doing this, and the many people over the many, many years who came to me and said that they each individually knew for sure what the object was. Everybody had a different idea, and everybody had some interesting details, no evidence to verify it, and a lot of what we know doesn't fit to what they saw. I mean, one of the first possible origin we heard at the time was from an Air Force officer who interviewed a family who was out there involved in the case. And he told them they had information that a Gemini capsule had been expelled in the area. And, of course, we know that isn't true.
Right.
Another guy over the years approached me, and he said he knows for certain it was a projectile that was fired from a giant gun on a railroad car in Canada. Of course, that didn't fit at all. Another person said he was certain that it was a Soviet ICBM that went out of control. And it just goes on and on and on. Of course, one of the most common theories, and we thought for years it might be related to it, was a Soviet Venus probe, Cosmos 96. Well, that's interesting because this Venus probe sustained some technical problems, and we entered the atmosphere on the same day, December 9th, at about 3:18 a.m. in the morning over Canada. This happened about 4:47 in the afternoon. So we always wondered, could there be some association here? And in more recent years, and the information we have, that pretty much has been eliminated now. Some of the media, a media person that did a lot of investigation on this back in, trying to think, 90s, had contacted the Soviet embassy, and they told him that whatever came down in Kecksburg was not of their hardware. I later had contact with the Russian Space Agency, and they indicated that whatever fell in Kecksburg, there was no correlation between what fell in Kecksburg and Cosmos 96. And then in more recent years, when Leslie Kean was doing the big investigation on this case for the Coalition of Freedom of Information that was backed by the Sci-Fi Channel, when they did a huge detailed investigation on Kecksburg, they were able to get into a lot of information, a lot of details that I was limited in what I could do. So a lot of things came to light, and they pretty much, from the data they got, pretty much eliminated Cosmos 96 as having any association with this case. And of course, yes, in more recent years, as books were beginning to get published on the Bell, the Glock, I began to get inquiries about it. And, while there may be some bits of similarities to some of the physical appearance, there were a lot of things that were being built by the Soviets and the U.S. that looked somewhat similar, okay? But, if you looked at anything that the Soviets and the U.S. was building back in the 60s, I talked to a lot of the guys that designed and worked on those programs at the time, and you looked at all the rivets and weld marks on them, and it was very, very obvious that they were man-made. And according to witnesses, this thing was seamless, had no rivets. It was like one solid piece of metal. In fact, the one witness who had been a machinist all his life told me, he said, it looked like somebody took liquid metal and poured it to an acorn-shaped mold. But it's big enough for a human to be moving around inside of. And so there are many, many unanswered questions as to what this thing was. And as I've said for quite a while, I said, when you look at all the data we have, I'm pretty much at a point where I'll say that my thoughts are at this point that it was either a very, very highly advanced, very secretive man-made space probe that was way ahead of its time, that had some type of reentry control capability, or we're dealing with something that's extraterrestrial.
A question that came in, and I'll add to this, it says, Stan, do you think that this thing could it possibly be a time travel craft or just a craft of space travel? And I guess my question to add on to that is, Did this thing get buried in the dirt? Did it physically crash, come through trees and stuff like that, or was it just sitting there?
I call it a crash landing.
Okay.
Because witnesses saw it come down. We know it crashed through into the woods, knocked over trees, caused tree damage, but it looked like the witnesses said it looked like it almost belly landed. It was completely intact. It's semi-buried in the ground, and it's there. It's in good shape. And, here's the thing that's interesting, too. In the summer of 1990, before we did the season premiere for the Unsolved Mystery Show on this case, a fella got in touch with me, and he ended up he told me, he said, I was one of the Air Force security police that guarded the object when it came into Lockbourne Air Force Base near Columbus, Ohio, the next morning, December 10th, during the early morning hours. He said they heard of this thing had come down to Pennsylvania. They were expecting this thing to come into the base. The security was extremely high. They backed a flatbed tractor trailer with the object into a hangar, and they used an entrance they didn't normally use, which, by the way, was confirmed by another independent witness. And he said they set up the security perimeter around that hangar, and they were given a shoot-to-kill order to anybody approach that hangar without the proper authority.
Wow.
And he told me he didn't stay on the team much longer, but he heard it didn't stay at the base long. It continued on to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. So other people later independently contacted me who confirmed exactly what building they took this thing to at Wright-Patterson. Now, whether it's still there today, we have no way of knowing. I mean, I know exactly what building it was taken to, and it was not Hangar 18, as a lot of people talk about. And so there was something there and something of importance that caused the government to react as fast as they could. And, could we speculate it could be some type of anti-gravity device? Other people have contacted me and said they believe that's what it was. Whatever it was something our government wanted to get their hands on very, very quickly to examine. And there's so much more to the story. Like I said, we could talk for hours and hours about what we've uncovered and some of the strange aspects of the case. And it's just an amazing, amazing story. In fact, I produced a documentary on this case. I won a film award called Kecksburg: The Untold Story, which I think it's still available through Amazon.com and on my website as well. But anyhow, it's an amazing story. Next year is the 50th anniversary of the case, and in July, the fire department has their big Kecksburg UFO Festival, which was a huge, huge 3-day event this year. And next year, I'm sure it'll be an amazing event. People from around the country are coming into this now, and it's a lot of fun for the family. It's free, and they do a lot of different things out there that you don't see in most of these festivals, so it's quite a unique event.
It's interesting you bring up that festival, because one of my listeners several months ago sent me some photos of that event, and it was just an interesting little side note that he said he put in the note. And he says, Pat, it's interesting. Went to the event. There's all these people. There's a lot of old timers around, and he said you kind of look around, and while everyone's having fun eating hot dogs and hamburgers and what have you, kind of look around and say, who the hell out here may know something more than any? You know what I mean?
Oh yeah.
Who may know something, but they're just keeping their mouth shut.
Oh yeah, and some of the witnesses do show up, and a lot of them are really reluctant to really talk about it too much now. I mean, a lot of them are just kind of tired and worn out about it. And, the reason the fire department is involved is because when this happened, the Kecksburg firemen were part of the operation that night. There was a lot of things that happened that involved the little community of Kecksburg, because the first witness I actually found, it wasn't until 1987 that we found our first actual eyewitness to the object on the ground. And I was holding a very big public UFO display at a local mall. And I mean, we had a tremendously big display that I did with my group. It brought thousands of people in for the mall, and they loved it. People from all over the state would come in, and it was a very, very large, and it was a great place for people to come forward with their accounts. And back then, I didn't have a lot yet on Kecksburg. I had a little display about it, and by sheer luck, this fellow and his family happened to walk by, and were overhearing a conversation between one of my helpers about Kecksburg, and the guy kind of says, were you talking about that thing that happened in Kecksburg? And they said, yeah. And he said, I was on the search team that found the object. Well, that just opened it right up. And they called me. I was out having a sandwich, And that fellow turned out to be Jim Romansky, who was the first eyewitness we had. And he wasn't from Kecksburg. And he didn't really, at that time, he really didn't want to get involved or get his family involved. But he did offer that he would meet with us and talk to us privately. And his story was that he was a teenager. And he was a volunteer fireman for a fire department, not Kecksburg at the time, but one of the mutual aid fire departments in our county. And he, as other fire departments, were called out to Kecksburg that afternoon to search for a possible downed aircraft in the area. So they're coming out. He came out with one of their trucks and a few of his friends, and they were coming out. They didn't know the firemen out there, and they were all getting together to set up a grid search up in this large wooded area where by that time it's dark, and they were looking for a downed aircraft. Well, they had radios, walkie-talkies, and Jim remembered how they left various small teams off in trucks to walk up into the wooded area and search, and so they weren't out very long when they got a radio call that one of the other teams had come across this object. So they hurried over to the location, and they're on this little embankment, and they're just a few feet away, standing there staring at this large object semi-buried in the ground, and none of them touched it, because they knew that whatever this thing was, it was something unlike anything they had ever seen before. They knew it was no aircraft, there was no meteorite, and they're standing there looking at this thing, and as they're looking at it, these two stern guys in trench coats, come down through the woods. And they look at these guys, they look at the object, and they said, this area is now quarantined, you got to leave here right away. Right behind those two men are soldiers coming down through the woods. And Jim said they were so close to each other, they were shining their flashlight beams on each other as they passed. And he and those other guys, they found their way back into that little community, back into Kecksburg, and they went down to the fire department truck station. And when they got there, the military was there, and they were using it as a temporary command post. They were taking, well, we heard like radio equipment, all kind of other equipment in, and keeping other people out at that point. There was a lot of military trucks down around there. And so it became quite an interesting evening. And again, we heard so many different stories of what was going on down there. One of the stories was I talked to the late Jim Mays. He was the first assistant fire chief of Kecksburg. He's the one that helped to organize the search teams. And as hundreds of people came into the area that night, all this was going on around the crash site, they began to blockade and close the roads down all around the area.
Hey, Stan, I got to stop you just for a minute. I got to take a quick commercial break, okay? And we'll be back right on the other side. Our guest tonight, Stan Gordon. Stick around. We got one more segment left. Our guest tonight is Stan Gordon. You can go check out his website at stangordon.info. An amazing researcher, Stan. Again, thank you for giving us some time tonight.
And thanks for having me on. I appreciate that as well.
So let's get back again with Kecksburg. Just so many. We were talking a little bit about, and that was a question somebody had was James Romanowski. But you were talking a little bit about him. You want to pick back up and finish up?
Yeah, I think I was mentioning about the firemen closing off the roads, and the late Jim Mays telling me how they were closing the roads down because so many people were coming in. And he also mentioned, again, the reason the firemen are supportive is because a lot of the original firemen at that time were involved in the operation that night, helping with traffic control and assisting the military in some ways. I remember Jim telling me how on one of their four-wheel drive pumper trucks that some of the military brass came in, and several of the firemen and some of the military brass were hanging on the rails on the back and side rails, and the military asked them to take them down towards the impact site, and they went down through the fields, and as they approached the woods, the military made the firemen stop and made the firemen go back, and the military kept going down. But, the thing is, as I mentioned before, unless the military was directed to where this thing fell, there's no way they could have possibly have seen it, because you couldn't see this from any of the roads anywhere around the area down in the wooded ravine where it fell down. And but unfortunately, the last fireman who was directly involved in some of the operations that night passed away last year, Bob Bittner. And so I got to interview many of the firemen who were involved in different aspects of the case, and a lot of them had different interesting things to tell me. And I've interviewed hundreds of people now who have direct and indirect information on the case, and there's just so many interesting details about this case that we still don't have. We don't have all the answers as to what happened.
Gotcha. I did read a couple articles Did the Canadian was there a Canadian air traffic controller or air traffic control that actually saw this thing on radar?
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay.
In fact, I can't remember exactly, but I don't think the Canadians at that particular time had their radar network up. I can tell you officially, the government, the Air Force said that this thing was not being tracked on radar. Over the years, I've had a number of sources who have contacted me who I believe were probably in a position to know, and they said, yes, it indeed was being tracked for quite a distance. That's how the military got there so quickly, that it was being tracked. They had a pretty good idea what general area it might be coming down, so they had the teams already notified and on the move, and that's how they were able to get there, within a relatively short period of time after it fell.
Gotcha. Interesting. What do you think? Anything for the 50th going to come out, Stan, or just little bits and pieces here and there?
Well, yeah, I truly believe there's people out there that are sitting on physical evidence, and the main evidence I believe it's out there because I've interviewed people who have seen it, is that somebody out there, I believe, has black and white photographs of the object down in the woods from 1965, and he also of some of the military trucks and personnel. And those photographs could definitely help open up and give us more information on the case and maybe close the case once and for all. But, we've had leads on it. I've talked to people who have seen those pictures, but somebody out there has them somewhere. And we're hopeful that the day will come somebody in those families might open up and provide them to the public as a part of history to finally give us some clues as to what this thing may really have been.
Very interesting. Very interesting. It's kind of like Roswell. Any talks of? I think I already answered that question. Obviously, no alien beings or nothing around it because it was a sealed device.
Well, there's more to it than that we found out. I'm not so sure we have enough time to even get into it right now. But there's some more information that we've gotten in more recent years that suggests the possibility that while there were no bodies on the ground as such, we have some information now that there is possibility that someone or something may have been inside of the object.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's an interesting kind of little newer detail. And yeah, there's a lot of things that are interesting about this case because officially that night, as everything ends around early in the morning, because we know they took this thing out around 1 o'clock in the morning,
right?
And that's when it went on to Lockbourne Air Force Base and on Wright-Patterson. But we now know that there were 2 military flatbed tractor trailers on the scene. The one went out earlier. It went out with a load that was longer and flatter, and the object went out early around 1 o'clock in the morning. And there's just some real interesting little stories. For example, Bill Weaver, who I mentioned before, is a very credible witness. He was over there by that dirt lane, and while he's standing there that evening with a group of other people, a big white unmarked box truck pulls up. And out of that box truck come out 4 guys he described as what they call moon suits, or some type of biological protective outfits they had on. Right. And out of that truck, they took about a 4x5 square box-shaped device, some kind of container on a stretcher-like device, and they carried it down into the ravine where the thing fell. And we understand there may have been 2 of those. Now, whatever that container was for, it was too small for the object. So the question is, what were they going to put inside of it? And so the story goes on and on.
You still there, Stan?
Oh, yeah, I couldn't hear. I'm sorry.
Oh, no, I'm sorry. I said all these little things just keep sprouting up.
Oh, yeah, well, we've known that for quite a while. And, I still get some leads on the case. I mean, I do many different events in this area and around the country on the cases I work on, especially when I'm out in the events here in western Pennsylvania. Very commonly, I'll run into some of the old-timers who will just come up to me and say, well, I was there that night. And a lot of them just figure, well, I already know about it. And basically their story is the same, that they were there, they saw the military people,
right,
couldn't get down to the site to see what it was. So there's still people out there that have information on it, and there may well be some military people, other government people out there who have some knowledge of this event. And, once again, I encourage people, if they want to talk to me anonymously, that's fine, because that information they have might be very important to giving closure on this case.
Yeah. Are you hoping someday that someone will hand you something and go, here you go, this will solve it for you?
Oh, yeah, you're always hopeful that somebody's going to have some kind of evidence or have those photographs that it'd be great for the 50th anniversary to have something that would give us closure after so many years.
I've had Stanton Friedman on the show a couple times, and I've told him, I said, I hope for your sake, Stan, I said, I hope for your sake someday you'll get a call and somebody's got something buried in the back of their sock drawer, that they'll pull out and they'll give to you, and it'll take everything,
Right.
You won't be able to dispute it.
Right. Well, I've known Stan for years. In fact, he was from Pittsburgh, and he started in the first group I got involved with, because he was just getting involved in this in the late 60s.
Right.
And
right.
he was a part of the original Pittsburgh Nightcap Subcommittee, which later became the UFO Research Institute. It was a smaller group, and I was probably the young guy in the group, but I already had a lot of experience, so I became their telephone sighting coordinator. So when they would get a call on a sighting, the report would come to my home, and I would do the initial interviews with the people to see if the cases warranted further investigation. And when that group shut down, that's when I organized my own hotline for the public and formed my own research groups.
Interesting. We've got just a little bit of time left. 2 hours went way too quick. Let's talk a little bit about these Mothman and Bigfoot. What's your take on this? I mean, so many people. There's so many. I know there's the hoaxers out there, and I know there's some people that have really discredited the cryptozoology community, without a doubt, with some of the games they've played. But with all these dedicated researchers like yourself out there, has anybody turned anything up? Or you were talking about interdimensional beings. Why don't you give us some of your thoughts on that?
Okay, well, going back to 1973, when luckily I had my first group already organized in 1970. By 73, again, we had taken over the state of Pennsylvania. And we had already been in a position where the police and the media were contacting us, referring cases to us to investigate. Well, it's lucky that we were set up, because 1973, there was this massive UFO wave that covered the state of Pennsylvania all year long, from the January 1st to the end of December. Hundreds and hundreds of UFO cases going on. And in the fall of 73, you may remember, there was a national UFO wave that peaked in the fall of 73 and was making a lot of news in the newspapers and on the evening news for weeks. But it was extremely busy here all year long. In the summer of 73, we had the biggest outbreak of Bigfoot sightings in history. And this went on for weeks and months into 1974. And a lot of these Bigfoot sightings were daylight. They were extremely close range. These were not like you see on TV, where somebody in a dark sees a shadow running across the field. Many of these were in daylight, where people were within 5 to 10 feet of these things. And that was a case where people looked out a window, or something walked off and ran in front of a car, for example. In some cases, there were more than one creature seen. There were 2 or 3 seen together. In lots of cases, there would be physical evidence. So our teams would get out there, and there would be trails of footprints, or there would be other evidence which showed great strength that something had been there. Sometimes hair samples, different things showed up. It was an amazing time. And, we don't have much time to talk about it, but, I had gone in believing that a Bigfoot was real back in the 60s, and I was convinced from some of the interviews I had done, and now I've interviewed hundreds of people at PA that claim to have seen Bigfoot, including in the last week. And anyhow, I was convinced these things were some type of unknown primate, something zoological that science had yet to confirm. And I still keep an open mind to all possibilities. But as these events are unfolding in 1973, odd things began to show up. For example, some of our teams would get out there, and you got to remember, a lot of the guys in the group, these guys were scientists. I had an anthropologist, we had physicists, we had chemists, we had former military intelligence people, we had people who were well trained. They get out there, and there's a series of footprints that suddenly stop and disappear when there should have been more footprints, for example. Odd reports were coming in from the public, and when we began to see patterns, we would have, for example, a UFO sighting in a certain area. Then within minutes to hours to days later, we'd have a Bigfoot sighting in the same area, or vice versa. And then we began to have amazing cases where UFOs and Bigfoot were seen together at the same time and place. For example, September 27th, north of Pittsburgh, two women are in a wooded area waiting for a friend when they see this huge, hairy creature with white hair, long arms swinging, crossing a road towards the woods, but in one of its hand, it had a small glowing sphere of light. And they went and notified the father on the property and went down in the woods where this thing had ran down towards. This object comes across and projects a beam of light down into the woods. Many, many other cases, including the famous case, and we could talk for hours about this case, October 25th, 73, up in Fayette County, where the state trooper just came back from this investigation, called me and said, you've got to get a team up here right away. This incident just happened. I think there's something possibly still up in the pasture. This involved a multiple witness UFO landing of a very large object coming down in the pasture and two Bigfoot in the field at the same time. And it was a very, very intriguing case, which I focus all this in my book, Silent Invasion, the Pennsylvania UFO Bigfoot Casebook, which has some of the weirdest, most bizarre events people read about. And my other book is called Real and Mysterious Pennsylvania, which you can get through Amazon.com or BarnesandNoble.com or my website. But anyhow, to make the story short, as more and more cases came to our attention, reluctant as I'm to say it, some of the evidence suggested that Bigfoot may not be a normal flesh and blood animal, but some of the cases indicated these things may be interdimensional. People shooting at them and then disappearing. One woman shot at one on her porch a few feet away with a shotgun, and when she fired into it, it disappeared in a flash of light. Just other weird, weird cases. And unfortunately, we don't have time to get into them, but that was when so many odd things happened. And as recent as this year, for example, we had a major snowstorm down in eastern Pennsylvania, and there was apparently some Bigfoot activity going on. There was a huge snow, like a foot and a half of snow, and a person told me an incident where his Bigfoot had walked through this heavy, heavy snow, and the next morning they saw this large trail of tracks in the snow that just suddenly stopped and vanished. So, I mean, this is the kind of thing you still hear about. I've said for years, I've asked the question for years, if Bigfoot is a normal animal, why by now don't we have more evidence? Why don't we have a body by now? It just doesn't make any sense.
Right, right. With so many people out looking for these things and getting just glimpses.
I mean, people see them, hunters see them, they walk in front of people's cars, but by now you would think that somebody would hit one by a car, found a dead body. Don't recommend shooting at them. Many people have, unfortunately, but nobody's ever brought one down. Something just doesn't make any sense here.
Right, right. Very interesting. Stan, a couple hours went way too quick. I want to thank you for your time. I know it's late out on the East Coast, but thank you for sharing all this with us, and I hope we can get you back again in the spring and just delve into it some more because there's so much of it here.
I'll be glad to. And, yeah, there have been so many just really amazing sightings in the last few weeks and months, and so once again, we'll talk about it in the future.
And again, people need to go check out your website. It's stangordon.info. They can buy the books through there, get the links for your books. You taking it easy through the holidays, or you have anything planned?
Oh, I've actually, they have me booked for a lot of events this year, and I'm getting booked for a lot of events next year, so anybody's interested in the lecture around the country, I've got a lot of very interesting topics to deal with.
You sure do, my friend. Take care. Hey, have a great weekend, and thank you so much for being here tonight.
Thank you for having me on, and happy holidays to everybody.
Okay, Stan. Take care. God bless.
Right. Good night.
Good night.